I've helped solve more than a few cases looking at someone's language. This case is just so unusual and so different than other cases we've seen, especially because almost 3 months later, it remains unsolved. I can't help but think that the only thing that I keep coming back to is somehow this involves Savannah Guthrie.
A backpack, a pair of gloves, and a way of moving, as if every step had already been memorized. No looking around, no rushing, no sign of randomness. If this were just a sudden act, why does everything feel so controlled? And if money was not the goal, then what could be important enough to make someone prepare this carefully? Maybe this was not the beginning at all, just the moment when the plan was put into action. This video is a reconstruction created for analyzing behavior and timeline. The content is not meant to accuse or make conclusions about any specific individual. It does not use any violent, sensitive, or shocking images. First fact: an 84-year-old woman, Nancy Guthrie, disappeared from her own home with no clear signs of disturbance and no sound recorded. Second fact: not long after that, a message appeared, asking for ransom in cryptocurrency, a choice often linked to cases that involve planning. Third fact: a security camera captured a person fully covered, carrying a backpack, moving in a controlled way, without rushing. When these three facts are placed together, they seem to form a very logical story: a kidnapping for financial gain. But the problem is this: the behavior that was observed does not fully match that familiar pattern, and that mismatch leads to the most important question. Is this really a kidnapping for money, or just the surface of something more complex? In cases that are believed to be driven by money, behavior often follows a clear pattern. A demand for payment appears quickly. The message is specific. Pressure is kept constant, and sometimes there are signs meant to show the victim is still safe in order to increase that pressure. Everything is focused on one goal: getting the money as quickly as possible. But in this case, the visual data tells a different story. The person seen on camera shows no sign of rushing, no constant looking around, no unnecessary movement or signs of stress. Every step is steady, controlled, almost as if it had been planned in advance. There is no feeling of a sudden situation, no sign of randomness. This difference might seem small when looked at on its own, but when placed in the full context, it creates a noticeable gap. Because when the goal is money, speed and pressure are usually the key factors. Here, what stands out instead is the calm and order in the behavior. And that detail forces us to return to the original question. Is the real motive as simple as it appears on the surface, or is there another layer that has not yet been seen? The content in this video is for informational and reference purposes only. Although it has been cross-referenced with reputable sources, some details may have changed or may not be entirely accurate. The reconstruction shows a small object placed near the entrance, something that might seem unimportant at first. But when you look closely, the difference is in its condition. It is not out of place, not knocked over, and shows no sign of impact. Instead, it appears as if it has been put back exactly where it belongs. This raises an important question. In a tense situation, would someone really stop to adjust such a small detail? Normally, when a person is acting in a rush or trying to leave quickly, the traces they leave behind tend to be random objects get touched, moved out of place, or simply ignored. But here, this detail suggests the opposite. It points to a certain level of control, not just in the actions, but in how the surrounding space is handled. Putting a small object back does not bring any direct benefit if the goal is only to leave quickly. But if the goal is to make the scene look as normal as possible, then that action starts to make sense. And from such a small detail, the way we see the entire situation can begin to change. It no longer looks like a series of random actions, but rather a process that may have been carefully considered, where every step, even the smallest ones, was part of a plan. In the recorded data, there is a short period when the home camera system stopped working. This is not unusual. Devices can lose connection for many technical reasons. But in analysis, what matters is not only what happened, but also when it happened. This gap appears at a very sensitive point in the timeline when key events are believed to have taken place. The timing is too close to ignore as a simple random issue. It becomes a dark gap in the data a moment with no footage, no direct confirmation, yet placed right at a critical point. Here, we are not focusing on how the system may have stopped. Instead, the focus is on what this timing means in the bigger picture. If a system stops recording at the exact moment it is needed most, then the question is no longer, why did it stop? But what happened during the time that was not recorded? In many cases, preparation does not show up through obvious actions, but through how the surrounding elements are set in place, even the presence or absence of data. And that is why, when a gap appears at the exact right moment, it may reflect more than just a simple issue. Because preparation is not a reaction. Preparation is often the result of a plan that was thought out in advance. Let's consider another possibility, not to make a conclusion, but to test how the data can be interpreted. If Nancy Guthrie was not the main target, then the entire structure of the story begins to change. The focus would no longer be on who was directly affected, but on who is actually at the center of attention. In this context, her daughter, Savannah Guthrie, is sometimes mentioned as someone with a certain level of public presence. This does not automatically create a connection, but it opens up a possibility worth considering in behavioral analysis. When someone cannot reach the person they are interested in, they may turn to people close to that person instead. This idea is often called proxy targeting, an indirect approach where the real target is not the person first affected, but someone connected to them. The key point here is not to prove this idea, but to see whether it helps explain the unusual details from how the behavior was carried out to the level of control and preparation that has been observed. It is important to be clear. This is not an accusation, and it is not a conclusion. It is simply a model that has been seen in other cases, offered here as one way to test the logic of the data. Because sometimes, to truly understand a situation, we need to be willing to look at it from a completely different angle. In the timeline, a message asking for money appears quite clearly, a detail that often leads people to quickly label the motive as financial. But when viewed through behavioral analysis, the question is not just, was money demanded, but what role does that demand play in the overall scenario? Because in some cases, money is not the final goal, it is a tool used to shape how the public understands the story. When the financial element is placed at the front, it creates a familiar explanation. A case driven by money, actions driven by gain. This can unintentionally hide other possibilities. If the real goal is to create psychological pressure, influence a specific person, or control how the story is perceived, then the demand for money may simply be the most recognizable cover. It draws attention to numbers, transactions, and deadlines instead of behavior and relationships behind the scenes. Other motives, if they exist, are often harder to see. Obsession, personal conflict, the need for control, or simply the desire to send a message. This is not a conclusion, but a way to shift the focus of analysis. Because sometimes, the most obvious detail is the one placed there for you to see, and what matters more may be hidden behind it. Based on what the camera recorded, it is possible to outline a behavioral profile at an observational level, not to identify who the person is, but to understand how they acted. The individual in the frame has their face covered, is wearing gloves, moves at a steady pace, and carries a backpack. Each detail on its own may not say much, but when placed together, they form a pattern worth noticing. Covering the face and wearing gloves are often linked to an awareness of avoiding leaving traces. This does not automatically explain the motive, but it shows a certain level of awareness of the surroundings. The slow, steady movement, without rushing or unnecessary actions, is also different from situations that happen suddenly. It gives the sense that this person is not simply reacting, but carrying out a sequence of actions that had been thought through in advance. The backpack adds another layer to that picture. It could contain anything, but in terms of behavior, it often suggests preparation bringing what is needed instead of relying on the situation. An action that involves preparation usually comes with an effort to reduce risk and maintain as much control over the environment as possible. It is important to emphasize, these observations do not identify who the person is, and they do not make any conclusion about responsibility. This is simply a way of reading the data through behavioral patterns that have been seen in other cases. And in those patterns, one common point often appears. The action does not begin at the moment it is seen on camera. It begins earlier, in the stage of thinking and preparation. The backpack in the frame is not just a minor detail. It carries meaning in how behavior is understood not because of what is inside, but because its presence suggests a certain level of preparation. A person carrying a backpack has often already considered the possibility of needing to bring something in or take something out, rather than relying only on what happens in the moment. In analysis, a backpack is often linked to the idea of a backup plan. It allows the person to stay flexible across different situations. It could be used to carry needed items or to collect something before leaving. Whatever the exact purpose may be, the common point is a sense of readiness. This creates a clear difference from spontaneous behavior. An unplanned action usually lacks these backup elements. The person reacts to the situation instead of controlling it. In contrast, when there is preparation, behavior tends to have structure, planning, and a reduced level of uncertainty. So the backpack is not just an object in the image. It is a behavioral signal suggesting that what is happening may have been thought through ahead of time, rather than being a decision made in the moment. In some behavioral analysis approaches, one possibility is often considered. The person seen on camera is not necessarily the one who created the original plan. In other words, there may be a separation between the planner and the one who carries it out. This is not uncommon in organized behavior models, where roles are divided to reduce risk and increase control. When a person focuses only on carrying out a task, their actions often appear precise, with little hesitation, because they are following a plan that has already been set. Meanwhile, the planner may not appear directly in the visual data, but is the one who decides the timing, the method, and the steps to follow. This idea, when placed alongside the observed details from the level of preparation to the way of moving, to the gaps in the data, can help explain why the behavior appears so steady and controlled. However, it is important to stress that this is not a conclusion, and it does not point to any specific individual. It is simply a possibility used in analysis to widen the perspective. Because sometimes, to truly understand a complex behavior, we need to look not only at what is visible, but also at what may be happening behind the scenes. If the idea of indirect targeting is placed on the table for analysis, then the next question is no longer what happened, but why was this particular person chosen to create an impact? In that context, someone with a certain level of public presence could become the center of pressure, even if they were not directly involved in the original event. From a behavioral point of view, there are several motives often considered when someone tries to influence another person indirectly. It could be a need for attention, a desire to trigger a strong public reaction, or a sense of wanting control over the situation and the people involved. In other cases, personal emotions such as conflict, frustration, or the need to assert oneself may also play a role. When these possibilities are viewed alongside the detail of the ransom message, another interpretation begins to take shape. The financial element may not be the final goal, but a surface layer that helps guide how the story is understood. It draws attention to transactions and numbers, while other factors may remain hidden. This is not a conclusion, but simply a way to expand the perspective. Because if the real goal is to influence a specific person, then the message, if there is one, may not be about money, but about a feeling. That distance is no longer a barrier, and that safety itself can be questioned. The most important thing at this stage is not to make quick guesses, but to stay clear-headed when receiving and sharing information. Cases like this often draw a lot of attention, and that can make it easy for online spaces to fill with speculation, assumptions, or rushed conclusions. Because of that, there is one principle that needs to be clearly stated. Do not try to track down or investigate suspects online. Sharing images, names, or unverified information is not only unsupported, but can also seriously harm people who are not involved. In many cases, false information can spread very quickly, while the consequences last much longer. At the same time, sharing rumors or unverified content can create confusion, making official investigations more difficult. Important details can get lost in a large amount of inaccurate information. A safe and responsible approach is to follow only official sources, and if you truly have relevant information, pass it directly to the authorities instead of posting it publicly. Because in situations like this, protecting accurate information is just as important as finding the truth. After looking at the full timeline and placing the details side by side, the remaining question for you is simple but not easy to answer. Do you think this was clearly driven by money, or could there be another layer of purpose behind it? A case centered around money, where everything else is just secondary. Or B, a personal act, where the money element may only be a surface layer used to guide how people see the story. Comment A or B, and more importantly, tell us which detail in the video makes you lean toward that choice. Was it the way the person moved, the gap in the data, or some small detail that seemed unimportant at first? 3 months have passed. Just when everyone started to believe that time had covered every trace with dust, a new piece of data suddenly appeared. It was not inside the house. It was not on the camera. It was in a place no one expected. One detail that has just been decoded could completely change the theory about that fully covered figure. They may not have been as unknown as we once thought. The truth does not disappear. It only waits for the right moment to show itself, and that moment is right now. See you in the next part. Decoding the identity from the impossible details. In this context, silence is not just a lack of information. It may simply be the stage where the data has not been released yet, or has not been fully connected. So instead of rushing to conclusions, what matters is staying focused on what has been confirmed, and accepting that the current picture may still be missing a piece. And sometimes, what makes a story worth watching is not only what happened, but what still has not been explained. In the next part, we will go deeper into how the scene was arranged and the psychological patterns that may help explain the details still left open. Not to make a rushed conclusion, but to connect the pieces of data together with clearer logic, step by step, layer by layer. If you are interested in how a timeline is analyzed and how behavior can be read from the smallest details, then the next part will focus entirely on that. And if you want to follow it as soon as the new video is released, subscribe so you do not miss it. Because sometimes, the answer is not found in one single detail, but in the way all the details connect together.